It's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Now it's time for our interview with Lisa Nelson, the CEO of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Lisa, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you today.
Yeah. We had such a great time at the summit and gala a few weeks ago. So I'm glad that we're able to catch up on Main Street Matters. I wanted to just kind of have you tell our audience who ALEC is and kind of what your mission is and inform them about all of the good things that you do at the state level across the country.
Well, I really appreciate that. And we're often misunderstood because we're kind of like a think tank, but we are absolutely engaged in working directly with our legislators and educating legislators across the country. We are a nonpartisan, primarily Republican, but nonpartisan organization that focuses on limited government, free market, and federalism issues. So to that, yes, music to your ears. I know everyone, when I say those three core principles, people just, it's kind of like, motherhood and apple pie and baseball. I mean, they are things that I think everybody really believes in, but it really is our litmus test. And so ALEC as an organization, and I should say that we celebrated our 50th anniversary this year in Washington, D.C. We were founded 50 years ago. So I always say something must have been in the water back in 1973 because ALEC was formed, the Heritage Foundation was formed, the Pacific Legal Center was formed, and I tribute Ronald Reagan for a lot of that because they were doing such groundbreaking things, building out the party, and the ideological organizations. But ALEC, as a nonpartisan organization, recruits legislators from both sides of the aisle, bringing them in to focus on policy solutions that fit within that rubric of limited government, free markets, and federalism. So if it pushes power back to the states, it's a federalism issue. If it is limited government, it's not growing government. We always kind of ask that question, is this policy, limiting the scope of government and giving more power back to businesses writ large? And I think that's why our partnership with Job Creators Network is so great. And this podcast is so great because we really try to be that kind of last advocate for small business owners, entrepreneurs, even larger businesses. But we really try to look for kind of the least regulation and the least of a regulatory kind of solution for any business so that they can be unencumbered and kind of grow their business as they see fit without a lot of government intervention. And just remembering that it is all, state-based. So where you see the federal government working on some things, oftentimes there will be a parallel policy. And in what I see in the states where you've got limited government legislators focused on these things, you see the economic kind of uptick and businesses thriving. Utah is our number one state. I'm sure you've talked about that with Jonathan Williams on Rich States, Poor States, which is one of our premier publications. Utah, Florida, Arizona, they're all just fabulous states that are working to kind of decrease the amount of regulation for business owners.
You mentioned federalism, and one thing Alfredo and I talked about during our Great Opportunity Project is, obviously that campaign was about highlighting the state successes and kind of nationalizing the message, because all of these governors had done, these conservative governors across the country had done such a great job dealing with COVID and also just economically with cutting taxes and regulations. And, we highlighted a few at our summit with Governor Ducey, Governor Reynolds, Governor Kemp. There's obviously more to talk about. But I think when Americans today hear the word federalism, they don't understand always that really means states' rights. Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. And, COVID really was a kind of a teachable moment, as I say, where you can talk about these issues and kind of see it in practice. Those governors that you mentioned were the ones that were keeping their states open and kind of bucking the trend of what was happening across the country. And you could really see the contrast between the blue states governors and the red state governors where that happened. But the word federalism is confusing because, we know it as people who are kind of in this work day to day. Federalism is, in practice, returning power back to the states. Article 5, the balanced budget, all of those kind of financial tools that give power back to the states. But most people in America, when they hear that phrase, they think the federal government. And I think that we've got to do a better job of kind of educating. We'll talk about education, I'm sure, down the road, but it starts with understanding the Constitution. It starts with understanding the balance of power. And the way the founding fathers kind of set up the country was really to make sure that those states had that power. We see it in the elections, the difference between the popular vote and the electoral college. And I think it's so important to think about the states. The way it was set up with the electoral college in particular is to make sure that no state was disenfranchised. You don't want, the states that are the most populous, New York and California, deciding who's going to be, elected into the White House. You've got to kind of give that power back to the states and make sure that each of the states are equally represented.
And I had this, I don't have this conversation with people that I know, but I read about the argument with the Electoral College from people who know better. I mean, obviously they know better. Senator Elizabeth Warren comes to the top of mind, but there are others who talk about the popular vote and that we should have a popular vote, and that, they kind of discredit the Electoral College. But I always kind of respond with, we do have a popular vote. It's a popular vote by state. I mean, essentially, yeah. Right? Because the majority in Florida elects, it sends their delegates to Washington to cast the vote for whoever won in the state of Florida. So they win state by state. So that's where the popular vote lies.
Well, and if you appreciate the motivation of the founding fathers and what they were looking at when they really set it up, that they wanted every state, because they recognize each state is going to have kind of a different complexion, right? They're going to come at different perspectives, I guess I should say, because you want to make sure that North Dakota and Florida and Arizona all have that voice in the elections. And that number, when you talk about your popular vote by state, you're exactly right, because each of those states has a different, the different count that's representative of their electoral base in that state. So, to my way of thinking, it's a beautiful kind of recipe for engagement from all the states. And I do think that some of the politicians who are gunning for the national popular vote should know better. They if they read their history books and they understand how this country, the United States, was set up, they understand that each of those states should be represented in an equal portion to their populations. So I think it's a beautiful setup. And I think that federalism also, I think on the balanced budget amendment, which is another key issue that we work on, everyone at the kitchen table, all of the Main Street Matters listeners go home and they balance their budget and they figure out how much they can spend and how much they can purchase. In their business, they're thinking through their budgets and how much they can invest in, new technology or new machinery or something like that. And this, kind of runaway spending that we've got right now has got to be kind of curtailed and reined in. And I think the states do that. They have balanced budgets, and they have amendments in their states. And I wish the federal government would follow the state's example.
Yeah, they can't print money. If they spend more than they have, they literally run out of money, just like we do in our families around our kitchen table. If we spend too much money, we run out. My dad always said, yeah, that's called having too much month at the end of the money was his expression when you ran out of money before the month was over. But my dad my dad is an attorney. It's one of my favorite expressions of his. He's from South Louisiana, so he's got lots of funny expressions. He's a lawyer though too, and one of the things that he always told me was that he believed that the founding fathers created this document that was roughly 4 pages long, and the beauty of what they were able to accomplish in 4 pages and the foresight is so amazing. And it's just frustrating when you hear people criticize the Electoral College and why it's there, especially people who know better.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
I wanted to also ask you, what are some of your big issues on the horizon that you'd like to talk about?
Well, thanks for asking. I think one of the most important things that we learned just in the post-COVID era was just how important education is. And I know, there's all kinds of different discussions about education going on, both at the higher ed, on college campuses, and free speech. But the thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is a huge influx and focus on K through 12. And this notion that the money should follow the student and not the system. So funding the student rather than the school systems. It's called education savings accounts. You can call them Hope scholarships. You can call them all kinds of different things. But across the country, there was 12 states that really zeroed in on this, led by West Virginia and then Arizona in 2022, and then another 10 states last year. I think that in the coming legislative session, 2024, we will see maybe even 10 more states add this element to their programming, to their budgets. And I think that there's so much support for it. It's not an anti-public school effort. It's more about injecting competition into the public schools, but also giving choice to the parents and to the students about what kind of education they really want. There's so much creativity and entrepreneurship in the education field. You're seeing schools that are devoted just to people who want to become chefs and, learning cooking skills. You're seeing schools being built out for engineering. You're seeing, so many different ways to educate our kids these days. And I think that is something we're really going to see build out and continue to grow and gather momentum in the next year.
Yeah, I know that you've been that obviously Job Creators Network we're very focused on helping support that effort. I know there's been states across the country that have ESAs already passed. How many have already passed them?
Yeah, so 2 states, West Virginia and Arizona, passed them in 2022. And those were both really amazing because they were 100% universal education savings accounts, meaning all the money and all of the access to all of the children was accessible. Some of the states, 10 other states in the last year, 2023, passed some variation of that. And then there's more states that have more limited versions. But I think what you're going to see is these gradations kind of increase. So I'm imagining that Louisiana is going to really focus on this in their coming session. They have a new governor, Governor Landry, who will take office in January. They've got legislators who were really primed to do this last year, wanted to get it done and couldn't get it done with their current governor. So I think you're going to see a number of states add this. And my my personal view is if you're going to try to create an education savings account, you want to make it accessible to all of the students. Some people and some states are focused on, well, let's just take a small bite of the apple and focus in on, the different communities, whether it's the underserved communities, whether it's disabled communities. But I really think that when you are going to go through this whole kind of step, you should make it accessible to everybody, inject that competition. You'll see public schools getting better and stronger and fighting for those students. And you'll see parents actually having a say and having some skin in the game into their kids' education. So I'm really, really hopeful. You mentioned our partnership, Job Creators Network, ALEC, Committee to Unleash Prosperity, and a number of other education organizations have gotten together to form the Education Freedom Alliance. And the idea there is that none of us want to care about getting the credit. None of us care about who's on first. What we really want is to make sure that the students have access to those funds and that they can be in the school that is right for them. So that Education Freedom Alliance is basically going to build off of what Job Creators Network did so well around tax cuts. You guys built, kind of momentum, and I call it conditioning the environment. You condition the environment so that everybody knows what you're talking about when this issue comes to your state. And I'm really hopeful that 2024 is going to be a banner year for that.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that parents would be against this. Tell our audience who are probably our biggest foe is going to be in this.
Well, when you poll this issue and when you ask the question, do you think parents should be in charge of their kids' education? 86% of the people in the country support this. The interesting thing is that the teachers' unions see this as a threat. And it's funny because at the end of the day, if the teachers are doing their jobs, this is not a threat. This is support for them. So I'd love to see them get on board and understand that competition is going to be better for them in the long run. I hope that's the case. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. I'd like to know who the 15% of the parents are that,
that don't think. Maybe one of them was Terry McAuliffe. He learned his lesson. He didn't think parents should have a say in in the kids' education, and he lost his election. So,
yeah, that was a big turning point in Governor Youngkin's election. Was parents, and it was parents from all walks of life, all parties, coming together as we as parents all learned things about what was happening in our schools that we weren't happy about, that we didn't agree with, and that our kids, essentially weren't learning in many cases, and they were learning things that maybe parents didn't want them to learn. And it's been a huge, talk about shining a light on something. This really opened parents' eyes. And I don't find, in my personal talking to people and asking them about their kids' education and schools and what's happening, I don't find a partisan divide amongst the parents I talk to. They are very concerned about what their kids are learning, and they do want choice. And even before I knew what choice was, when my kids were very little, I had my kids in alternative schools instead of sending them to the public school. I just felt like that was a good choice for them at the time. And we got what we got out of it, and they enjoyed it. But I do know that those schools that came into the communities were very underfunded, and the teachers in the public schools and even some of the parents were very negative about those schools.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I don't, when you're looking over your child's shoulder and you're seeing what is being taught and you're seeing the way that it's being taught, you tend to engage. I think that we've talked a lot to the legislators that are passing these in their states. And Senator Rucker in particular in West Virginia, when we asked her, what are the numbers? What are the trends for the public schools? Her answer is really interesting. She says, it's It's the parental engagement that is what we're after. It's parents being involved in that choice that you made, that I made. My kids are very, very different. And if you don't feel that whole phrase, skin in the game, if you don't feel like you've got skin in the game, you kind of check out. And this is a way of checking parents back in and giving them that skin in the game. And they very well may say, after they've done their whole analysis, the public school is okay. But through this process, I've figured out how to communicate with the teacher. I've figured out how to communicate with the principal. I've figured out how to send a message to a school that I don't like one element or one thing that they're doing. And I think that's what we're after, is that much more engagement, that much more participation. I know parents, your days are stretched and you're working and you're, getting food on the table and everything else. But that investment in your kids is going to pay off in the long run. And I chose different schools for my kids, one public all the way through. And I'm a product of all public schools. So, it's just different for different students. And anyone who's got kids knows that those needs are going to be, a variety of different choices for you.
So what are the next steps in moving this forward with the Education Freedom Alliance?
I think the most important element of that, Elaine, is just to make sure that we're ready for this next legislative cycle. We're trying to get the word out that this has passed in these states. And interestingly enough, the numbers are staggering. And when Iowa passed theirs, they said they have room for 75,000 students. And literally in 48 hours, they had applications for over 75,000 students from different schools for that funding. So, if you think about supply and demand for all of the, the entrepreneurs out there listening, supply and demand for this is there. We've got to make sure that the schools are ready and are able to take on new students and additional students. We've got to make sure that the back end, which is kind of complicated, but the back end of that funding mechanism is in place so that when a family applies for that funding to follow the student, that funding is there. Each of the states is treating that differently. There's some new business models that are doing that. Some of them are doing it through their state education entities. And at least for the Alliance, I think we're going to be at our States and Nation Policy Summit in 2 weeks out in Arizona. And Alfredo Ortiz will be there. I don't know, Elaine, if you're going to be able to join us or not, but we will be there planning with legislators from all over the country to figure out what are the states that we're focused on. I would say Texas and Georgia and Louisiana and several others are the top of our list. But we're going to be looking at what are the best states to really focus on and how do we educate the legislators to make sure they understand that parents really want this and that if they move it forward in their state, they will be supported.
And how can parents get involved right now? I mean, how do they tell their state legislators that they want this?
Well, there's a couple of different things. We do have a website, Education Freedom Alliance, and we do have a URL 25 by 25 because that would be 25 states getting it done by the year 2025. They can send an email to Lisa Nelson, Nelson at ALEC.org. And tell us that they want to be involved. There's all kinds of different ways. And certainly they can get in touch with their legislator directly, which is probably the most direct route, and let them know that they want to have an ESA in their state.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you. So it's 25by25.com or it's Education Freedom Alliance. Is it .com or .org?
.com.
.com. EducationFreedomAlliance.com. or 25by25.com. So I want to thank you for joining us. This is such an important project. And of course, at Job Creators Network, we are so interested in supporting this and happy to be part of this coalition. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters today, America's Small Business Megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.